Elias Hunt sat in the dimly lit corner of a small tavern on the edge of a forgotten planet, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, and nothing was ever certain. His eyes scanned the room, every movement, every glance, and every whisper felt like a potential threat. But nothing seemed out of place in this quiet corner of the galaxy. He had spent years hiding here, blending into the shadows, pretending to be just another face in a crowd of strangers. Elias was the last of his kind, a relic of a war long past, the last surviving human in a galaxy that had long since abandoned humanity to oblivion. When the war ended, the humans disappeared, and the galaxy moved on, leaving behind only the bitter memories of a species that had been both feared and revered for their incredible resilience and ingenuity. The galaxy had forgotten about him, or so he thought, until a whisper on the wind reached his ears, a whisper about a human, a survivor of the old war, a survivor who had managed to stay hidden for decades, surviving in silence as the galaxy around him shifted and evolved, a survivor whose very existence was a threat to the peace that had been forged after the bloodshed of the past. Elias had no interest in being the symbol of anything, no desire to bring back the human empire that had been shattered by years of endless fighting. He had no family, no friends, and no allies. The galaxy was a place where humans no longer belonged, yet here he was still alive, still breathing, when so many of his people had been extinguished long ago. He tried to ignore the rumors, tried to keep his head down and his presence unnoticed, but it was impossible. The galaxy was too small, and his kind too legendary for whispers to remain secret forever. Soon enough, his name would be known across every star system, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Elias knew this. He knew the galaxy's ruling powers would stop at nothing to find him. They would want to know how he survived, what secrets he held, and more importantly, they would want to know if humanity's legacy could be used to shift the balance of power in their favor. Elias's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden entry of a group of armed individuals. They didn't look like the typical bounty hunters he had encountered in the past. Their eyes were sharp and calculating, and they moved with the confidence of those who had seen much and done even more. They were here for him, and it was clear from the way they scanned the room that they knew exactly who they were looking for. Elias stood up slowly, his muscles tense, his mind racing. He had been prepared for this moment for years, but now that it was here, it felt different. Somehow the weight of his existence seemed unbearable. The burden of being the last human felt like an unshakable anchor, dragging him down into the depths of inevitability. He had never wanted to be the center of anything, but now it seemed he had no choice. The galaxy's long-sought secret was no longer a secret, and it was coming for him. Without hesitation, Elias turned and walked towards the back exit of the tavern. As the group of armed strangers moved in his direction, his heart pounded in his chest, his every instinct telling him to flee. But he couldn't run forever. Sooner or later they would find him, and when they did, everything would change. The galaxy was vast, and yet it had a way of shrinking. When secrets began to leak, every faction in the ruling council had its spies, its networks, its fingers in every corner of the universe. The news of a human surviving had spread faster than anyone anticipated. Whispers turned to rumors, and rumors turned to hard fact, as more and more individuals who had once heard the tales of humanity began to believe them again. Some laughed it off as myth, but there were others, those who remembered the wars and the destruction humanity had once brought, who felt a cold shiver at the thought of the last human still breathing somewhere in the stars. In the towering cities of the Council's central worlds, the leaders convened in hushed rooms surrounded by screens and holograms, displaying the vast expanse of the galaxy. Their faces were a mix of concern and curiosity, each one calculating the potential consequences of the news. The human race had been wiped out in a bloody conflict years ago, the last remnants scattered to the far reaches of space. Now Elias Hunt was alive, and the power of that truth rippled through the galaxy like a silent storm. Sivan, the leader of the Selthan Empire, an ancient race known for their strength and cunning, was the first to speak, his voice cold and calculating. The Exelthan were the most feared species in the galaxy, known for their ruthless tactics and ability to manipulate galactic politics. They had always viewed humans as a threat, but also a prize if captured alive. The technological potential of humanity was unmatched. He had heard the stories of their war machines, their creations that could turn entire fleets to dust in seconds. But what if Elias was more than just the last human? What if he held the key to something far more valuable than anyone realized? Across the room, Nira, the High Commander of the Shalar Dominion, a race known for their mastery of diplomacy and subterfuge, raised her voice with a sharp edge. The Shalar believed in peace through diplomacy, but they also knew that power could not be left unchecked. Humans had been a thorn in the side of the galaxy's power structures, and the thought of one surviving among them filled Nira with dread. The Council would not risk allowing humanity to rise again. Meanwhile, on the fringe worlds, the news of the human survival was met with more curiosity than fear. Smugglers, traders, and mercenaries took interest in the rumors of Elias's existence. They knew that the galaxy's rulers would be willing to pay handsomely for information about him. The right price could buy a fortune, and as much as some feared the chaos Elias might bring, others saw the opportunity to profit from it. As the galaxy's most powerful factions mobilized their forces in secret to find Elias, the last human continued to elude them, drifting in the shadows, where no one would think to look. No one except for the bounty hunters and the mercenaries who had their own reasons for wanting to capture him. Elias had already encountered a few of them and had learned to stay one step ahead. His survival instinct was sharp, and he knew how to blend in with the unremarkable crowds of the galaxy's lower worlds. But even Elias knew that time was running out. The galaxy was a web of power and intrigue, and his existence had stirred the ancient forces of history. A war between the stars was brewing, but this time it wouldn't be fought between two opposing sides. It would be a war for the future of the galaxy itself, and Elias Hunt, whether he wanted it or not, was about to become the focal point of a conflict that could burn the entire universe to its core. Elias had always prided himself on being invisible to the galaxy's powers, to fade into the background and never draw attention to himself. But now that very skill felt like a curse. The whispers had turned into something much more real. People began to ask questions. Where had Elias been hiding all these years? And why had no one heard from the last human since the end of the war? The bounty hunters came and went, always close, always on the edge of his location. But Elias was always one step ahead, always slipping through the cracks and into the shadows. He had found a temporary haven in the abandoned station on the edge of the Brennar system, a place where few ever ventured and fewer still returned. It was a home to outcasts, the forgotten, and the unwanted, the types of people who had no allegiance to any galactic power, no need for the riches or the status that came with serving one of the dominant empires. These people lived in a world where survival was more important than politics, but it was also a place where Elias knew he could disappear for a while. Yet even in this isolated corner of the galaxy, the news of his existence reached him as he sat in the back of a bar nursing a drink and listening to the endless chatter of travelers. One particular conversation caught his attention. A group of smugglers were discussing the reward being offered for information about a human survivor. Elias's name had been linked to this reward, the bounty on his head growing larger by the day. His heart raced as he realized that every corner of the galaxy seemed to have turned into a hunting ground for him. The galaxy's eyes were on him, whether he liked it or not. The crew of a battered freighter called the Wayfarer had arrived at the station 2 days ago. Their leader, a gruff woman named Rilia, had an air about her that Elias recognized instantly. She was no ordinary smuggler. She was a strategist, someone who could see the bigger picture in any situation, and as Elias overheard their conversation, it became clear that Rilia and her crew had learned more about him than they should have. They had tracked him down, and now they were watching him carefully. Rilia's eyes met Elias across the room. For a long moment she didn't approach him, but he could feel the weight of her gaze, as if she were assessing him, sizing him up. Her crew of outcasts stood nearby, exchanging looks. They knew Elias was no ordinary man, but it was clear that they weren't sure what to make of him. Yet there was something in the way Rilia watched him that told him she wasn't just interested in the bounty, she was intrigued by him. Elias knew he couldn't stay here much longer. His presence was already too well known. and the longer he lingered, the more dangerous it would become for everyone around him. He had always kept to himself and trusted no one, but the weight of the situation was changing his mind. The situation was too big for him to handle alone. He needed allies if he was going to survive this. The following evening, Elias was approached by Rilia in a quiet corner of the station's common area. She didn't sit down at first, just watched him for a long moment before speaking. "I know who you are, Elias Hunt," she said, her voice low and steady. "And I'm not here for the bounty. I'm here because I think you're worth more than just a price on your head." Her words hit him harder than he expected, and for the first time in a long time, he found himself considering the possibility of working with someone who might actually want something more than just his life or death, someone who might be able to help him navigate the treacherous galaxy that was closing in around him. The next few days were a blur of planning and uneasy alliances as Elias and Rilia's crew navigated the volatile underworld of the Brennar system. Despite the constant threat of being discovered, Elias began to see the crew not just as mercenaries or outcasts, but as people with their own scars and histories. Rilia, though distant, held a quiet authority that commanded respect. She had dealt with more than her fair share of dangers, and she didn't seem intimidated by the bounty hunters who circled like vultures. But Elias knew that danger was inevitable. He could feel it in the air, the way the station buzzed with unease, the way strangers glanced at him with a mix of curiosity and fear. The news was spreading faster than he anticipated. A human, alive after all these years, was more than just a ghost from the past. He was a living relic of an old war, and with it came the possibilities of power, destruction, or even a return to the forgotten human dominance that once nearly tore the galaxy apart. Rilia had arranged for them to meet with a contact, someone who could provide information about the last known location of the human weapon, an ancient piece of technology that Elias had no memory of but had heard whispered about in fragmented stories. Rumors told of a weapon humanity had built, a weapon capable of shifting the balance of power across the galaxy. It had been lost in the chaos of the war, buried with the fall of the human empire. But if the weapon was real, and if someone found it before Elias did, the entire galaxy could be at risk. The contact was waiting for them on the dilapidated space station known as the Iron Bell, a rusted hulk of a structure that had long outlived its purpose. As they docked, Elias's sense of foreboding grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything he was doing was leading him into the heart of something far larger than himself, a storm he couldn't control. Rilia led the group through narrow, dimly lit corridors of the station, her crew keeping watch. They finally arrived at a door sealed with ancient security codes. As she entered the code, a voice crackled through the door's intercom. "You must be the human." Elias froze, sensing the tension in the room. The voice was cold, mechanical, and unfamiliar. "I have the information you seek," the voice continued, "but it will cost you." Rilia's eyes narrowed, but she nodded, gesturing for Elias to step forward. They were met by a tall figure in a dark cloak, their face hidden under a hood. The person stepped aside, revealing a small data terminal embedded in the station's wall. The figure didn't speak, only nodded at the terminal. "Data on the weapon," the figure said flatly. Elias stepped toward the terminal, hesitating for a moment. A chill ran down his spine as he connected his hand to the device. As the data streamed into his mind, he saw the truth of the weapon, a weapon designed to wipe out entire fleets in a single strike, a weapon that had been built to ensure humanity's survival at any cost. It was capable of more than destruction. It had the power to alter the very fabric of space itself. Elias's blood ran cold. "This isn't just a weapon," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "It's a force of nature." The cloaked figure looked at him intently. "If it's activated, it will destroy everything. The weapon doesn't distinguish between friend or foe." Rilia watched him carefully. "Then we can't let anyone get their hands on it." But Elias knew that stopping the weapon wasn't the only problem now. He had become the galaxy's most dangerous prize, and someone would do whatever it took to get to him and the weapon. No matter what, The galaxy would be reshaped by his actions, whether he wanted it or not. The weight of the revelation sat heavily on Elias's chest as he pulled his hand back from the terminal. The data was seared into his mind. An image of the weapon's blueprint, its intricate design, and the chilling understanding that this weapon could unravel the galaxy. His fingers trembled, but he forced himself to steady his breath. The last thing he needed was to show weakness now. Rilia watched him carefully, her brow furrowed with concern. "We need to move fast," she said quietly, her voice edged with urgency. "There are already rumors circulating about the weapon. If the wrong people find out we have the location..." Elias didn't need to hear the rest. He already knew. The moment they stepped out of the Iron Bell station, the hunters would be on them. Every faction in the galaxy, from the merciless Selthan to the scheming Shellar, would want control of the weapon, and with it, control of the galaxy itself. Rilia's crew made their way back to the ship, the Wayfarer, at a quick pace, their steps tense but focused. As they boarded, Elias could feel the quiet desperation in the air. Each person seemed to be wrestling with their own thoughts, their own fears, but none dared voice them. The stakes had become too high. Even those who had once been willing to gamble with their lives knew that this was different. This wasn't just about credits or power. It was about the future of the entire galaxy. The freighter's engines hummed to life, and the ship shuddered as they took off into the void. Elias sat in a corner of the cramped cockpit, staring out at the stars. The vastness of space had always felt like a refuge, a place where he could disappear into the unknown. But now, the stars seemed cold, indifferent, as if they too were watching him. His existence had become the spark for a new conflict, one that could very well consume the galaxy. As they jumped into hyperspace, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The ship's sensors picked up faint, erratic signals, traces of ships that seemed to be shadowing their movements. Rilia didn't need to ask. She knew as well as he did. The hunters were already closing in. "They're on our tail," Elias said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. Rilia's gaze hardened, her fingers flying over the controls as she adjusted their course. "We'll outrun them," she said, but Elias could hear the doubt in her voice. Even with all her skill, there were limits to what the Wayfarer could do. And the longer they spent in hyperspace, the closer the hunters would get. They had to make a decision. Fast. "Where do we go?" Elias asked, looking to Rilia for direction. Rilia hesitated before speaking. "There's an old smuggler's route near the Tarnath Nebula. It's dangerous, full of pirate traps and rogue asteroids, but it's our best shot at losing them." Elias nodded, his gut tightening. The Tarnath Nebula was known to be a graveyard for ships that thought they could brave its storms. But it was also a perfect place to disappear. If they could get through it without being caught, they'd have a chance at finding a way to destroy the weapon and put an end to the madness once and for all. As Rilia charted their course, Elias leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. He could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. His life, the weapon, the fate of the galaxy. Everything had changed in an instant. But in the stillness, Elias realized something that he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before. There was no going back now. He had made a choice by surviving, by showing his face to the galaxy, and the consequences of that choice would follow him, no matter where he went or what he did. The journey to the Tarnath Nebula was anything but calm. As the Wayfarer hurtled through hyperspace, Elias could feel the tension rising among the crew. The hum of the ship's engines had become a constant reminder of the imminent danger they were in, a ticking clock counting down to the moment when they would either escape or be caught. Rilia was at the helm, her face set in concentration as she plotted their course through the treacherous smuggler's route. Her crew was on edge, standing watch and preparing weapons just in case. The closer they got to the nebula, the more the atmosphere inside the ship seemed to darken. Even the usually talkative members of the crew fell into a rare silence, their eyes darting nervously to the viewports as if they expected danger to appear at any moment. Elias had never been good at waiting, especially when the weight of the galaxy was on his shoulders. He stood up from his seat, pacing the cramped cockpit, his mind racing through possibilities. His hand brushed over the cool metal of the walls as he tried to focus, tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut that told him something was about to go terribly wrong. "Do you think we'll make it through?" Elias asked, his voice breaking the silence. He didn't look at Rilia as he spoke, but he could feel her gaze on him, sharp and calculating. "I don't know," she answered simply. "But we don't have a choice. If we turn back now, they'll find us. We're running out of time." Her words were like a cold slap, and Elias knew she was right. The longer they stayed in hyperspace, the more time the bounty hunters had to catch up. They were getting closer, and the farther they ran, the more the galaxy's powerful factions would close in on them. Every move they made only made their position more precarious. A soft beep interrupted their conversation. Rilia's fingers flew over the console as the sensors picked up something large and fast. Her face turned pale as she analyzed the readings. "We've been found," she muttered under her breath. "They're here." The sharp, cold truth hit Elias like a hammer. They weren't going to make it to the nebula, at least not without a fight. He could already hear the dull roar of distant engines outside, the unmistakable hum of a fleet that was closing in fast. "They're not just following us," Rilia said, her voice tight. "They've surrounded us. We've got no way out." Elias's mind raced. His pulse quickened as the ship's alarms began blaring, indicating the incoming attack. He could feel his heart in his throat. This was it, the moment everything changed. "I'll hold them off," Rilia said, her tone final as she slammed her fist onto the controls, diverting power to the weapon systems. "You're not going alone," Elias replied, moving quickly toward the door that led to the ship's lower decks. Rilia glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not giving you a gun, Hunt. I don't care how good you think you are in a fight. This is too dangerous. I've survived this long for a reason." Elias shot back, grabbing a blaster from a nearby rack. He could feel the familiar weight of the weapon in his hands, and for a moment, it was as though he was back in a different time. A time when survival wasn't just about hiding, but about fighting back. Rilia didn't protest further. Instead, she pressed a button, and the ship's hatchway opened with a hiss, revealing the chaos outside. The stars beyond were now filled with the silhouettes of enemy ships. It was a trap, and they had walked right into it. The bounty hunters had done their homework, and Elias knew this wouldn't be a simple escape. The hunters weren't just after him. They were after something bigger. They wanted to control him, control the weapon he could lead them to, and they would stop at nothing to get their hands on him. Without another word, Elias followed Rilia and the crew as they prepared for the inevitable conflict. The door shut behind them, and the sound of weapons charging filled the air as they geared up for the battle ahead. The ship shuddered as incoming fire from the enemy fleet made contact with their hull. It was no longer about escaping. It was about surviving. The moment the door slammed shut behind Elias, a cold realization settled in. The Wayfarer was already shaking from the first barrage of incoming fire, and the sound of weapons charging and clanking echoed through the ship's corridors. Rilia was already at the controls, her eyes scanning the battle map as she shouted orders to her crew, but Elias barely heard her. His mind was focused on the imminent danger closing in around them. The galaxy was closing in on him, and there was no escape. The enemy fleet had them trapped, their ships positioned in a perfect blockade around the Wayfarer. He could see the flicker of their engines outside the viewport, sleek, black warships moving in unison. They were fast, too fast to outrun in the damaged state of their ship. Rilia turned to him, her expression hard. "We're not getting out of this unless we fight back." Elias nodded, though he didn't feel much like fighting. He'd fought wars before, fought in ways no one should have to. But the weight of the galaxy's factions descending on him felt different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a battle for control, and if he lost, It could mean the end of everything. "You ready?" Rilia asked, her voice no longer the cool strategist, but one of someone who knew the stakes. Elias didn't respond with words. He just nodded again, gripping his blaster tighter. It felt too small for the task ahead, but it would have to do. They weren't about to get a full-scale battle with the enemy fleet, not unless they wanted to die in a spectacularly expensive way. Their only chance was to fight smart, hit hard, and get out fast. Rilia pushed a button on her console, and the ship's guns came online with a loud thrum. The sudden rush of power was a brief comfort in the chaos. Her crew sprang into action, manning various weapon stations, sending return fire at the enemy ships. The sound of blaster shots and explosions rocked the ship as the outer shields flared, absorbing impacts that would have obliterated any lesser vessel. But Elias knew it wouldn't last. The shields were already flickering, weakening with each hit. If they didn't do something soon, they'd be sitting ducks. "We need a way to break through their blockade," Rilia said, her eyes focused on the battle map. "But I don't know if we have the firepower." Elias took a deep breath, looking out at the fleet closing in on them. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations, his military experience kicking in. His survival instinct was always sharp, and now it screamed at him that there was only one way out, one chance to get them through this. "There's a narrow channel," he said suddenly, his voice steady despite the chaos. "A gap between their lines near the left flank. If we hit it hard and fast, we can slip through." Rilia's eyes flicked to him, then back to the map. She didn't hesitate. "Do it." Without waiting for further instructions, she powered up the engines, sending the Wayfarer into a sudden burst of speed. The ship lurched, and Elias could feel the force of acceleration pushing him back into his seat. He could hear the shriek of the ship's hull as it scraped against the atmosphere outside. The blockade was closing in faster than he'd anticipated, but there was no turning back now. The enemy fleet was too focused on their current trajectory to notice the Wayfarer's sharp pivot toward the gap. They hadn't expected it, and that hesitation would be their downfall. Elias gripped the edges of his seat, his breath shallow as they tore through the narrow opening. Enemy fire raked across the ship, but the shields held just long enough for them to slip through the gap. For a moment, it was as if they had made it, escaped. The Wayfarer surged forward, its engines roaring, blasting through the remaining pockets of enemy ships. But the feeling of relief was short-lived. "We've got company," Rilia muttered. Elias turned to see several enemy ships break away from the blockade and begin pursuing them. The real fight had only just begun. The Wayfarer jolted again as another blast struck its side, sending sparks flying through the walls. The ship shuddered under the force of the attack, but Rilia held steady at the controls, her hands flying over the console as she deftly avoided another incoming barrage. The enemy ships had split off from the blockade and were now pursuing them with deadly precision, their weapons locked on to the Wayfarer's weakened hull. There was no more room for escape. Their only option now was to fight, and fight hard. "We can't keep this up," Rilia growled, her voice tight with frustration. "We need to take them out now." Elias's mind raced. The ship's shields were down to less than 10%, and they were still being relentlessly pursued. Their speed was their only advantage now. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, but his training kicked in. He'd faced impossible odds before, but this was different. He glanced toward Rilia, her face lit by the glow of the cockpit's display, sweat beading on her forehead. She was giving everything she had to keep them alive, and he knew he couldn't let her fight alone. "Where are we headed?" Elias asked, his voice even though his heart was hammering in his chest. Rilia didn't look up. "There's a safe haven up ahead. An old rebel base. It's hidden in a nebula. We can lose them there if we make it." Elias didn't respond. He knew better than to argue. The rebel base was their only shot, but getting there would be nearly impossible with the enemies on their tail. "Get us there," Elias said, strapping himself in. "I'll handle the rest." Rilia's gaze flicked to him, uncertainty in her eyes, but she didn't argue. She just nodded. "Hold on." She pushed the engines to their limit, the Wayfarer lurching forward with an almost desperate speed. The stars outside stretched into streaks of light as they shot through space, the nebula looming ahead like a dark veil. But the enemy ships were closing in, firing relentlessly. Elias made his way to the rear of the ship, where the weapons systems were located. He grabbed a plasma rifle and began loading it, his hand steady despite the growing chaos. The ship rattled as another explosion rocked the hull, and Elias felt the vibrations reverberate through his bones. They were running out of time. 3 ships closing in. Rilia called from the cockpit. "They're trying to box us in." Elias didn't waste a second. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, lining up his shot with the enemy ship that was closest. The weapon hummed with power, and he fired a quick burst. The plasma rounds hit the enemy ship's engines, sending it spiraling out of control. It exploded in a brilliant flash of light, debris scattering in all directions. 2 down.